welcome to the Religion and Popular Culture podcast, where we talk about religion, popular culture, and everything in between. I'm your resident anthropologist of religion, Vivian Asimos, and I am here with the sociologist with the mosteologist, Aled Thomas. Aled, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. I was thinking in a conversation that we had earlier, Vivian, about how I've sometimes introduced myself as a sociologist with anthropological tendencies. Maybe you could be an anthropologist with sociological tendencies.
As we were saying before, what's really the difference?
Yes, that was a hot take that I once shared on Twitter. That qualitative.
I was reading this piece on sociology and anthropology in the body. Mm-hmm. And there was somebody who was talking about, like, this is how anthropology breaks it, and this is how sociology has done it. And they were citing some of the same people in both, like Bordeaux and stuff was mentioned in both, and things like that. And I was like, then really, what is the difference? Why are you even separate? Why not just talk about, like, the way that these both disciplines have approached this? Because you're mentioning the same people. Why are these two different sections?
Yes.
Anyway, today is not about...
it's not about interdisciplinary
Today is not about
madness.
The differences between sociology and anthropology. Maybe a different day if people want that. That would be like a bonus special of us being like, well, historically, this has been the difference.
We would have to really do our homework on that one as well.
Well, my understanding, for anybody who is curious, my understanding anyway, has been that most of the difference has been more in the historical approaches to both topics, but that our contemporary research and anthropology and sociology are pretty much the same.
Yes.
Because a lot of anthropologists now use quantitative and a lot of sociologists use qualitative. A lot of anthropologists talk about society at large. A lot of sociologists talk about very small specific groups. So all of those things that used to be the big difference is not really present anymore.
Indeed.
But again, we're not talking about...
And as you said, we're often using the same people as well, whether it's Mary Douglas or Max Weber and so forth. I know plenty of anthropologists who use Weber.
Exactly. That's what I think. Weber and Bordeaux are two people that are often used as both sociologist and anthropologist simultaneously. Sociology
does boast, as a side note, a fantastic range of beards. If you look up some classic sociologists, although I guess that is a side product of any old white male academic, but certainly in sociology there's some tremendously great beards.
That's what you have to look forward to when you do work in academic fields, is look for the beards of the old white men.
I was going to say, an oft neglected topic in the sociology of religion are the beards at play.
Can your next article just be an analysis of sociological beards?
Yes. See what theories certain beards have in common. The sociologists with longer beards tend to think X, whereas the sociologists with shorter beards tend to think Y.
I love it. I would love it. But we're not talking about sociology and anthropology today.
No, we're not. But
so today we're going to have a bit of a dirty episode.
Mrs.
We're going to be talking about some explicit content. This one will definitely be marked as explicit.
Ooh.
What was that noise?
I don't know. I'm just trying to sound engaged. I'll be quiet.
One of these side effects of being a anthropologist and somebody who is very into their work is that every single thing that you watch or that you do in your life suddenly becomes like something where you go, oh, I could write a paper on this. Yes, so that's what we're talking about today. There is a new show that has popped up on Netflix that is called How to Build a Sex Room. I think this is available through most Netflixes, although I don't know whether certain countries have blocked it.
That would be interesting, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Which would be very fascinating to find out. So if it is blocked in your country, please let us know. I would be fascinated to find out. But it's a Netflix run one. It's a Netflix original, so it's not like it's, a licensing thing. So it should be, unless blocked, available on all Netflixes.
Netflix
I highly... Yeah, what's the collective term of Netflix?
I think
A
it is
stream
just,
of Netflixes?
yeah. I think it is just Netflix, isn't it?
Probably. Anyway, it's available on Netflix. I highly suggest watching it if it is something that you feel comfortable with watching. I highly suggest it. It's very interesting for a lot of reasons. So there's only a couple of episodes that are up. I think my husband and I watched pretty much all of them in like a weekend and a day or two. Like it did not take long for us to watch all of them. They're only about 20 or 30 minutes long per episode, and there's only like 12 of them or something like that, 10 or 12. So basically, the gist of the show is that there is a woman... Oh my god, I should pull up her name. Hold on. I'm gonna have to edit this out, this long silence, while my phone loads.
Well,
But
while you're doing that, then I'll fill the void by saying, what's the show called?
It's called How to Build a Sex Room.
You may have already said that, but
I mentioned it in passing. I will mention it again. How to Build a Sex Room. It is featuring... these are all just like people talking about it. Oh my god, what is wrong with me? You know, I had like Melanie Rose. I had notes. I did notes for this. I did notes weeks ago, and I didn't think to write down her name.
Honestly, miss, I did homework.
So, it's an interior designer by the name of Melanie Rose who specializes in building sex rooms for people. And so then it's her going to different people in the Colorado area in the United States, building sex rooms for them. And they are quite varied. So some of them are a bit more of your kind of what you would probably be thinking of when I say a sex room, where it's very like dungeony. And then there are other ones where it's just like she's redoing their bedroom and it's just making it a bit more nice and sensual.
Well, I was going to ask Vivian, as somebody who's not seen this show, what really is the difference between what makes a sex room compared to just a room in which one has sex?
Well, this is what we're going to talk about today.
Ah, excellent. I'm tapping into the core issue.
Because one of the things that really stood out to me when watching this is how often Melanie talked about the importance of having a separate space. A space set aside from the everyday for a romantic sexual interaction with your partner or chosen partners for that time period. And I see your face, and you are already starting to probably go along the same lines that I did as soon as those words left her mouth, which I went, could I talk about the sacred and profane in regards to sex?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that's what we're going to do today.
Good.
Because I find this really fascinating. So part of what the show does, and I want to kind of talk a little bit briefly about the show, but then I think we're going to get more generally into the idea of sacred and profane and what it means for something to be sacred, as well as the role of sexuality in our culture. Which, and again, I should stress, I am originally from America. I now live in the UK. Alid has grown up in the UK. We are talking about a very specific society and a very specific culture, and other countries and other areas, and hell, even other areas of the UK can have very different cultural, social understandings of sex.
Yes.
So we are only talking about what we know of within this group, and we acknowledge that within our approach.
Indeed.
We are doing our positionality, as it were. So one of the things that they set out to do, I think the purpose that Netflix had in doing this show was to break down a lot of the stigma around talking about sex and discussions around different types of sex and kink and things like that exists. And they really work to normalize a lot of it. I guess there can be a larger discussion on how successful the show was in that regard. Whether or not they actually were breaking down the stigma, I think that's something that Melanie Rose, at least, was really trying to do. Whether or not the production of the show was successful in carrying that out, I think would be another really interesting conversation to have. But I think what is important in what she was trying to do was to talk about the importance of, for her, the importance of sex as a connection point in the creation of healthy relationship and in the construction of house and home. And I say specifically for her because one of the things that was not talked about in the show was asexuality. And particularly asexuals who do not have a favorable view of sex. Those asexuals are probably not listening to this episode because they get uncomfortable hearing or being around discussions of sex, which can be very difficult in societies that do highly sexualize things, and we'll talk about that as well. So obviously those discussion points were not brought up. Most of it was definitely allonormative, but it was not heteronormative. They had a lesbian couple. They had I think they had a couple that was queer in another way, where it was, I think, someone who identified as a woman and someone who identified as non-binary. You had a gay couple that were also long distance, so you had that kind of dynamic, and you actually also had a polyamory family that also wanted a larger space for everyone in the family to be able to join in, rather than it being just for two people. So it did help to break down some of the heteronormative ideas of sex, which I guess is something. So what I want to talk about, though, is the idea of the dedicated sex space. And this was something that is kind of reiterated in every single episode and is also the primary kind of thesis point for the show, is the idea of sex as being something that is important to be present in the everyday, and yet something that needed to be kept separate. Something that needed to be set aside, and it was something that was special. And I think she constantly used the phrasings of something that was special, something that was set apart, something that was kind of unique and different and elevated to kind of set aside, which obviously to me harkened a Durkheimian conception.
Yes, definitely.
So, I am going to stop talking because I've been talking for a while. So, Aled, would you like to use your wonderful Welsh accent to regale our listeners with Durkheim? I think we've talked about Durkheim a couple of times on this show, but just for people who are new or need a refresher to Durkheim.
Yes, so the core idea of Durkheim's idea of the sacred and profane is that the sacred is something often otherworldly, something that is quite profound and something that is set apart from everyday life. So the idea of the Durkheimian idea of religion as being something sacred is that it is something that exists beyond or apart from everyday, and then the profane is your everyday life, your mundane activities, and it's the division between the two in which you see the idea of religion, which, if you're listening to this podcast, you may think this is quite different to the approach that Vivian and Aled often take, where we say that there isn't a division between the two. They are blended together. They are one. But the primary thesis of the sacred and profane is the division between the two and the way that they are set apart from one another. Religion as being something, often, I don't want to use the word ineffable, because that's quite a loaded term, but something difficult to describe, difficult to comprehend, something set apart from the everyday mundane, which ultimately doesn't matter, in inverted commas, in the grand scheme of spirituality and one's role in the universe. I hope I riffed.
I think that was a pretty good.
Thank you, because you did put me on the spot a little bit there. I
mean, it's Durkheim. I don't think that's really putting you on the spot.
That is true. I
have done much worse putting you on the spot.
You have, yes. So
I also have notes that you are privy to, whether or not you look at them.
Well, I was going to say, I didn't realise that there were notes for this episode, which I know makes me look incredibly unprofessional.
I always have notes because I am crazy.
No, you're not crazy at all. Notes are a good thing, and I normally look at them. I assure my listeners. Our
To be
listeners,
fair,
rather.
these notes are quite short because I kind of wanted to spend time just kind of talking about a lot of the concepts. So it is just a lot of like, we're going to talk about Durkheim. Durkheim, as much as, like Aled said, we don't, both me and him tend to depart from a Durkheimian understanding. And so it's something that we personally tend to get away from. However, I think he's come up quite a lot on this podcast because it's the way that I think a lot of people think about religion.
Yes, I completely
agree.
agree.
To be honest, I think it's the way a lot of people think about just life. That there is stuff that is everyday and normal and banal, and then there are stuff that are special.
Which is
that
so
is
based
set
on one's
apart.
positionality anyway. That's
is.
my problem with this Durkheimian approach is what's considered to be sacred and separate and therefore special is an entirely subjective category. And of course, as we were just saying at the beginning of this episode, that, you know, we are going to approach sex and so forth in one particular way. Sex itself is approached and understood in so many different ways as well, that to have this clear-cut binary between the sacred on the one hand, the special on the one hand, and the everyday on the other is, in my opinion, very problematic. Because just to use an everyday example, I was listening to the radio recently. They were talking about the Commonwealth Games and the importance of the Commonwealth Games for people from Birmingham, because it was held in Birmingham this year, and people who were into sports in general. Now, I am not a sports person. I could not that I mean to devalue the Commonwealth Games, but to me that does not seem special. But for many other people, it does. So those binaries between the everyday and the sacred, and I know some people may have a problem with me comparing sport to the sacred, but that's precisely the point, is the subjective nature of these categories.
Well, I could also use a purely religious example, which is the idea of praying every night before bed or every morning before you go out. This is something that is every day. It is very built into your regular habit. And I can say this as someone who I do this. I have my deity of choice. And every morning, I will do a short little like, hey, thanks for letting me wake up in the morning, and let's approach this day together, and then I move on. And this is something that I do every single morning. It's just part of my morning routine in the same way that I get up, I make tea, I make my husband a sandwich for him to take to work with him.
Aww.
We sit down and we watch shows on YouTube while he eats breakfast. He leaves, I take a shower, I do my prayers, I go up and go to work. Like, this is part of the normal everyday structure. But this would be something that most people would put in a religion camp. Something that is seen as separate. And yet it's inbuilt into my everyday functionality. Same thing with a lot of some of the things that we've talked about in season 1 of this, well, season 2 technically, of this podcast. In our previous season, we did a lot of those kind of preemptive, we talked about this beginning of this season, where last one was a lot of like, hey, these are the kinds of topics we're going to be talking about. And so they were a bit broad. We talked about fashion and religion. We talked about food and religion. And these are things that are every day. Choosing to eat kosher or halal is entirely based on your religion, and yet impacts the most banal, basic aspects of your life. And you could, I guess, argue that that's what makes it special, but if you're used to eating that way, it doesn't seem special. It's just how you eat. So these are the kind of things that,
Absolutely,
you know, can really question this binary.
It reminds me of, in Scientology, there's the idea of being in com, which is basically a shortened version of being in communication. That in Scientology you can study techniques for the way you successfully interact with other people. And if you are successfully in com with someone, then you are essentially on the same page. you are having effective communication. This is a really everyday aspect for Scientology, whether they're speaking to fellow Scientologists or an outsider, that they are attempting to be in effective communication. And I guess this is one of those many examples of how Scientology really does blur the lines between what many people would consider everyday and what would be considered to be religion. But that is an everyday aspect. That's something that is engaged with and not seen as being special in the sense that somebody is engaging in an activity that they don't engage with frequently, for example. I often see that binary of sacred and profane being broken down to the sacred is only engaged with on occasion, whereas the profane is something frequent, and that's what makes it profane. It's that everyday, as you were saying, having lunch, watching a TV show. They're just quite banal, very frequent, whereas the sacred would be, for example, taking part in communion once a week. It's the lack of frequency that sometimes makes something special, and sometimes it's easy to feel that something is more special because you don't engage with it as often. To use a very silly example, the popular Wizard song "I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day" is a bit daft, because if it was Christmas every day, it would lose its significance. Do you, Vivian, wish that it could be Christmas every day?
Well, no, but that's because Christmas isn't exactly my favorite holiday either.
Well,
Halloween.
Yes.
Halloween, we could have a conversation.
But it's the lack of but silliness aside, it's the lack of frequency sometimes that can make something special.
Yeah. So, what I find interesting about whether it is intentional or not, the use of this binary in relation to sex, is that I think that for many people, sex would be seen as inherently profane. Let's be honest, sex is gross. Like, it's gross and it's very body oriented, and it is something that is supposed to be, I know, I'm sorry. But I think that for many people it would be seen as inherently profane, and yet for other people it would be something entirely sacred and entirely special and put aside. There have been a lot of religions throughout a lot of history that has used sex as a form of religious interaction.
Yes.
Sometimes in a very problematic way, and
yes.
sometimes not, but it is there. And, but I think in a lot of the ways that at least contemporary US and UK societies are concerned, sex is something that is inherently profane rather than sacred. And so I find the drawing of this really interesting. When I know that, Alan, you have not seen this show yet, because there was a heat wave and you wouldn't want to watch a sex show while it's hot.
No, it's just, I'm already hot and bothered.
I was gonna say, this is also, unfortunately there's no video that we do associated with this podcast, but if there was, there would be a subtext interest conversation going on here, which is the fascinating thing that happens to UK men when you talk about sex.
Please elaborate, because I think I know what you're gonna say.
I have never seen someone be so uncomfortable.
Do I look uncomfortable?
You seem a bit uncomfortable.
I'm not saying that I'm not, but I'm just genuinely interested.
I have seen more discomfort in discussions about sex before. Probably the most English person I've ever met was my PhD supervisor, who also had the most English of names.
Of course, I'm not English, so I'm not...
well, no, that's why I'm saying British for you. I am... But I have a very English PhD supervisor, and one of my chapters in my PhD was about people writing slash fiction about the Slender Man, which is a whole nother conversation that we could have. But basically it meant that an entire lengthy PhD supervisory meeting, we were talking about sex and about sexualization of figures, about rape, about assault, but also about consensual sex and about the relationship of this whole thing. And my PhD supervisor was a very fidgety man, just naturally. I have never seen him so fidgety, so uncomfortable, and that is the shortest amount of time that we ever talked about one of my chapters. He waited until we had 2 chapters to talk about so he could spend as little time as possible on that one so we could jump to the next one, because he did not want to talk about it.
Yeah, it is interesting because I think in the conversations that we've had, I've had some sort of urge to crack jokes in a misses kind of way, which I think I've even said already on this podcast. It's very I'd be interested to know this as an American. Vivian, are you familiar with the Carry On films?
No, but it's also probably because it's films and it's me.
Well, these are a series of films that were made. I think the last one came out in the 1980s, but they were at their peak between like the 50s and the 70s. Incredibly problematic films. By modern standards, they're British films. They starred British actors, British comedians, and all the jokes were about sex. And it was all with that very British sense of humour of... The joke is that everybody's obsessed with sex, but because they're all British, they're all a little bit... Oh dear, don't want to talk... Do you know what I mean? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's that carry-on mentality that a lot of British men tend to have. But
probably.
But they're incredibly problematic films if you were to watch them now. Good grief. But yes, I know I've definitely noticed that needs to resort to humor. I mean, I'm the sort of person who resorts to humor a lot of the time anyway in social interactions. But that is an interesting point that you made. So how are American men by contrast? Say if I was an American academic, how would you expect me to?
I mean, I think there would be, because I think that one dimension of the discomfort is a gendered thing. I don't know whether there would be the same amount of discomfort if I was identifying as male. And so there were 2 men talking about sex. Or if you identified as female and there would be 2 women talking about sex. But the fact that we are of differing genders, I don't know whether or not that adds to a social discrepancy of how one speaks. I love how I'm now just starting to completely analyze our podcast. This is the most meta I think we've gotten.
Yeah. But I'm genuinely.
But it's interesting, and this actually goes into a lot of what we're going to be talking about when it comes to this idea of sex and the sexualization in culture. Because the other thing that you kind of pointed out is the fact that there is a lot of discussion of sex in our culture. And sex is kind of everywhere. And yet people are very uncomfortable when you talk about it.
It's very euphemistic though, isn't it?
It is. So I think, to answer your question though, I think American men would also be very uncomfortable. But I think there's a very specific way that British people get uncomfortable that I just find funny.
There's a very... there's also that British politeness.
Yeah.
That's
it's just a little bit of a squirmy and a righto rather than
yes, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
No, I do know exactly what you mean. And that's an interesting point to pick up on, because there's all this conversation about neutrality in scholarship. But there is no such thing as neutrality in scholarship. You know, even just this conversation about sex, for example, you've picked up on the fact that my background as a British person, although I don't describe myself as British.
You can say Welsh, that's also fine.
But my background, my gender, for example, these are all playing into the way that just the way I'm having this conversation, let alone the conclusions that I may come to personally and so on, the way that we are conducting this conversation, and as a result, the way scholars would conduct their research of gender, is always being influenced by what happens around them. And that's okay. As long as you are making sure that you check any assumptions that you have, and ensure that you're not letting biases get out of control. I think it's so important for us to note, as scholars, that we are always going to carry baggage, for want of a better term, social baggage, when we discuss something. And acknowledging that is actually part of making the discourse better, because you can acknowledge some of the more problematic aspects of baggage that you bring to subjects. If you've been raised in a society, for example, that has been, quite unfair to a certain group of people, for example, you need to acknowledge the effect that could have had on you in your youth and in your mindset now approaching the topic. So and I think you also mentioned this the other day, Vivian, about how problematic it is sometimes when people say, "Oh, I don't see color."
Yeah.
Well, you should, because you need to acknowledge the issues that are at play. So I think that's essentially what I'm coming to there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, when we talked about at the beginning, when I made a comment about our positionality, and I meant it kind of as a joke, but this is what, if we were writing this as an article to be published, that would be something that would be immensely important, is for us to mention our position, of us saying, this is where I come from, and this is what I have grown up around, and I'm going to try my best to be objective, but I acknowledge the fact that these things, my position in this world, is going to affect the way that I am seeing things. And as long as I am acknowledging this is where I'm coming from, so that way anyone reading this paper can bring that into account when they're analyzing it, that's really important. And so when we talk about reflexivity and positionality in research, that's a really important thing. On a side note, and also kind of related, because we are talking about sex today, there was a paper that has blown up the social media of qualitative research. I will not mention this paper because it is horrendous and it is terrible. But there have been some really eloquent takedowns of this article and of how bad it is. And some of them have really made it clear the lack of positionality, the lack of saying, here's who I am and where I'm coming from and why I see things a particular way. Because that's a really important that's just one of the many things that was wrong with this article. But that's another discussion for another time. But in this one, I think that's why it's really important for us to start this conversation about sex, to say, hey, we come from this society. We come from this background. I identify as female. I also identify as asexual, which is another interesting commentary about sex, because this really painted a lot of the way that I watched this show. Yeah, I am sex favorable. I'm not sex repulsed. So I have a very different relationship with sex than, say, another asexual person might. But I did not grow up feeling sexual attraction to people. And I still don't feel sexual attraction to people. So when I watch shows that are very heavily about sex, I kind of have to just learn a lot from them. And I found that when I was watching this show with my partner, we ended up talking a lot about how things work for us. And not just from the position of, oh, well, what are you into and what are you into? It was more about, how do you feel? Yeah. How does this feel for you? Because I don't feel the same way that you do, in the same way that he doesn't feel the way that I do. And it opened up those realms of communication. But having that is also a really interesting way to approach sex, as someone who has never felt sexual attraction and doesn't know what that feels like, to then be talking about sex and how sexual attraction is entirely fueling our society. It makes it almost difficult to notice. One of the big ones, this is a fun thing that I discovered. I've been recently getting really into different asexual groups and chatting with people, and it's been really fun to see people experiencing the realization in life in the same way that I did, but I didn't have anyone to bounce it off of. But one of the things that everyone in those groups have always talked about is how it took them so long to realize that certain songs were about sex. And
right, okay.
Yeah, and the biggest one that they always joke around about is "My milkshake brings all the boys to the yard."
And they're like, it's better than yours.
And for the longest time, and I was with them, it was like, yeah, this is just about, like, milkshakes. What else would it be about?
Oh, that song's a classic.
And I was recently listening to a podcast that was going over the album Songs About Jane from Maroon 5.
Oh, good grief.
Which is the most, like, sexy art, like, album. Like, it is just purely about sex.
That's
the whole album.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
I listened to that album when it came out. I owned it. I listened to it so many times. Had no clue.
There is a line on that album that I'm not going to quote on this podcast. I will quote it to you later because I think it really pushes the boundary of tasteful lyrics.
There is some dirty lyrics.
Yeah, I haven't actually listened to that album from start to finish. My friend who owned it at the time said, "You will not believe how filthy this record is." And I thought, oh, really? Because Maroon 5 were a little bit of a middle-aged person's band. Like, my parents enjoyed a bit of Maroon 5 on the radio at the time. They've become a lot more, like, pop-oriented. They were pop anyway. Irrelevant. But the point I'm making is that they seemed quite middle of the road in visually and so on. But yeah, definitely. And the album's called Songs About Jane. I don't know who Jane is or how she feels.
It was his ex-girlfriend.
I really hope her name wasn't actually Jane.
I think it was.
Okay. Yikes.
Yeah, but there was, like, one of my favorite songs on that album is the song Sunday Morning, which I thought was just this really nice song about, like, enjoying the chill weekends with somebody and, like, how you can just, like, hang out and you have, like, a slow morning and you get to lay in. Like, this is how I was interpreting it. And then it literally wasn't until, like, 2 weeks ago when I was listening to this podcast where I went, holy crap, that song is about sex? I'm so oblivious sometimes. Yeah. But
and it shows your positionality and the way it's affected the way that you heard the same song that other people heard.
Yeah.
You engaged with it in the same way, but you came to a very different conclusion.
It's fascinating.
So your baggage, and I know baggage is the wrong term to use here because
but it is.
But yeah, something that you have brought. My favorite film critic.
It's all our luggage.
Yeah, my favorite film critic says that what you take from films is what you bring to it, and that's so often the case with just discourses in general.
Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things that's really fascinating about discussions about sex, particularly in the UK and in the US, is this paradoxical relationship that sex has in society, where it is everywhere. It's in the songs that are playing on the radio. It's in adverts that are, like, being blared at us. There is sex everywhere. It is hard to watch TV. We were talking before the recording about how I've been watching Stranger Things. And in one of the very first episodes in season 1, there's this really drawn out thing of a teenage girl who's, I'm sure the actress is actually like 27 or something, but she's playing someone who is underage and she's having a sex scene. And even though, like, there's no nudity in it, it was, like, weirdly uncomfortable. I'm like, this chick is supposed to be, like, 16. Why am I watching this extended scene of her potentially having sex with a guy? Like, it's unnecessarily present. And that's just how all TV shows are, all movies, all adverts, everything is like that. Yet, sex is something that is supposed to be private. It is something that is not supposed to be present in normal society. And I'm using quotes around that for those of you who are listening.
Massive quotes.
Massive quotes. It is supposed to be hidden. It is supposed to be separate. It is not supposed to be there. And yet it is everywhere.
Yes.
And I find that aspect of our society so utterly fascinating.
Yes. And sometimes drawing attention to that can be taboo. I was watching a show the other day. This gag has been done so many times, but the fact that this gag is still being done is the case that there's an attractive woman in a show and she says something reasonably provocative, or she's wearing something quite provocative, and then the guy is holding a champagne bottle and the cork goes. And you've seen that joke. We've all seen that joke. It's in everything. Everybody knows what it means, but they don't comment on it. Because it's a sly nod at the camera and saying, "Oh, do you see what's happening here? But you still don't say it out loud. Like, for me, that conversation, that's what that gag is. It's there, it's present, you're aware of it, but at the same time, you're not going to spell it out, for want of a better term.
So what I find interesting about how to build a sex room, and this conversation of the sacred sex room that is kept apart, but is also a part of the world, is also that paradoxical thing. They talk extensively on that show on how important sex is for a quote-unquote normal life. Because again, you don't need sex to be a whole human.
No.
That is absolutely unnecessary. However, that is the way we are taught. We are taught that you need to have sex to be a full human. You need to be having sex in your relationship to be a healthy relationship. This is what is absolutely necessary. And yet, we're not supposed to talk about it, and it's supposed to be kept apart and kept to be private. And what is interesting about this show is that it is openly talking about sex. Very, very openly. I mean, the whole show is about people talking about their kinks, about what they're into, about whether or not they like being tied up, about how to tie up people. There was a whole episode showing how to, like, tie up people on ropes in a safe way. Like... it's very overtly talking about sex. And yet is reiterating this conception of sex as kept separate. But is still feeding into that idea of the sacred and the profane in a way that I don't know if people would be okay with the idea of sex as being sacred. And yet sex is supposed to be put aside in something special.
Well, I wanted to ask you about this, because you mentioned earlier on in the episode that this, I can't remember her name.
Melanie Rose.
Melanie Rose. So you mentioned that Melanie Rose has designed bedrooms.
Well. So in the show there were a couple of bedrooms that they did as well.
Okay, that's interesting, because I've got two questions. The first question being, a bedroom is also for sleeping. And you mentioned that there needs to be a space set aside for sex. Isn't that sort of undermining that? Or not so much undermining, but blurring that by saying that, well, you don't just have sex there, you sleep. Second question, as a follow-up to that, does Melanie Rose essentially treat sex rooms as a liminal space?
Ooh.
I'm sorry for throwing that on you.
No, it'll be interesting. Well, I think, do you want to explain what you mean? For those, I mean, I think liminal is something that is used quite often in normal, I say normal language, like academia is not normal, but it's not. Yeah, in colloquial terms.
Yes, is the sex room seen as a space wherein normal social conventions don't apply? Where, and really, kind of like that Durkheimian idea of something sacred, something that is completely apart. So is the room somewhere where one goes to, engages in a certain activity that they may not normally associate themselves engaging with in everyday life, and do they then return out to that room and engage in a very different type of life outside of it?
And for the purposes of the show, it depended on the room.
Right. This is why I asked about the sleeping part.
Yes. So there were a couple of different types of rooms and a couple of different ways of approaching it. I would say that the ones that were in bedrooms were a lot more complicated. There was a really interesting one where this was a couple that had like kids, and so they wanted like a space like away from the kids that was their bedroom that they could kind of be with each other and not as parents. They wanted to be as a married couple. And they installed a stripper pole in the room. Now, the person seemed happy with it, so I'm no one to judge. And, whatever, do you, girl.
Yeah.
But there was a part of me that just went, but won't your kids see the stripper pole?
So, was the room off limits for the kids.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't know. I'm assuming. And they didn't seem upset, and I don't think there's anything wrong with a kid seeing a stripper pole in the first place. I should mention.
But
I don't see a problem with that. But for them to have made a concerted effort to say that the kids were not supposed to be knowing about this stuff, and yet to install a stripper pole seemed very strange to me. But I think in that kind of space, then I think in that case, in that room in particular, the bedroom served a double function, where the bed was the bed, but then the stripper pole was kind of almost where the special sex would happen in a way. Like, that was where... you're talking to the wrong person, man. But, like...
Well, this was the other question I was going to ask, when you just said about, the kids not being aware, but, like, how can you make any sort of sex room that also fools someone into
so this one was fascinating.
Okay, good.
So this was one of the very first rooms. They converted part of the basement. A lot of these were in basements, which I was like, you're just asking for a specific type of sex room if you're putting it in a basement.
Yes.
But they were putting it in the basement, and they actually created a fake wall to go in the middle. So if you went just downstairs, it looked like the basement was only like half the size that it actually was, and there was like a bookcase or something with some storage stuff on it.
Please tell me that you just move a book and off
They opened the bookcase to be like a secret door to get into the sex room.
Bravo, that's fantastic.
Which is amazing. It is amazing. And when we were watching it, Tom, my partner, for people who don't know, but Tom was watching it, and he just goes, can you imagine these kids are going to be like 16 and they're going to be looking at the house from the outside and then looking at the inside and going, I feel like there should be, like, the basement should be bigger. Like, why isn't the basement bigger? I feel like the schematics show that the basement is bigger. I
would love to be a fly on the wall when those kids eventually one day inherit that house and are clearing things out and then move one particular book on the shelf.
They find their parents,
and then greeted with their parents' sex.
I mean,
dungeon.
Also, it's a televised show on Netflix. They're gonna see it at some other point. To imagine that wasn't the case, and that these kids were discovering it. Me and Tom are both making up these different scenarios in which they magically discovered the sex room.
That is hilarious.
Which is just ridiculous. But yeah, so in that case, for example, that was very much kept separate. That was hidden. It was so separate.
Yeah. So in that bedroom, to come back to the one with the pole.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just really innocent, but how does one make it different to a bedroom then?
Well, yes. So I think that the way they did it was that they tried to make it more sensual. And now this is where my asexuality...
Any kid will just walk in and see like handcuffs hanging on the wall or something and think...
Yeah, it wasn't that overt.
Right, okay.
I mean, sometimes they would stage things very clearly for like to show off in the show, like... So they would have, like, a vibrator on the table, and it's like, that would go in the drawer of the table. Like, but they'll leave it out because they're showing off for the purposes of the TV show.
Yes.
So, they would have things like that. But, so I think there were some things like that, some of the toys and stuff that were left out, but would clearly be in the drawers near the bed rather than being on display.
Mm-hmm.
But they focused a lot on aspects of sensuality, and this is where sometimes I don't know how much my asexuality like messes with my ability to do things, but to me I was like, I don't really understand the difference of this in relation to other furniture, but this is just my thing. But they were focused a lot on the types of textures that would be very evocative of sensuality, which again I was like, okay, soft shit, wouldn't I want that everywhere in my house? But I also don't have kids, I guess. I don't know.
Well,
so the bed the bed had like nice, like fluffy things that you want to touch, that you want to be laying on, that feels good against naked skin, essentially.
Well, with respect to the interior designer, isn't that just regular interior design, just comfortable?
Well, and I think
They're
there is a certain amount
cute.
of this particular interior designer, Melanie Rose, started as a normal interior. Say normal. This is everything is absolutely normal.
A non-sexy
We should
interior.
really stress this.
Yes.
It is absolutely normal. But did not specialize in sex rooms previously. And then shifted to sex rooms because of the fact that they wanted to ensure that sex rooms weren't just seen as this dirty thing that weren't just also needing to be pretty.
But then isn't that and just making it profane?
Well, and so I think that there is something really the whole show is really fascinating from an anthropological perspective.
Yeah.
Just the idea of the show is interesting.
So the core discussion point here is, if one puts a stripper pole in one's bedroom, then does one undo Durkheim's theory of the sacred and profane?
Well, yes, because I that's kind of what I was trying to get at with this whole thing, is that it's really fascinating that it is both sacred and profane at the same time. And even though they are using Durkheimian language, I don't know if they're aware that they're using Durkheimian language. I'm sure they aren't, because who the hell knows except us. But
oh, how dare you!
But they're using this Durkheimian language very clearly and in a way that is very normal, that the way that we structure our language and our categories, because again, when we're talking about societies and cultures, we categorize things.
Yeah,
and this is one of the ways that people categorize things, is in this dichotomy of special versus not special. And the way that they put things in both categories without saying that that's what they're doing. And that's just absolutely fascinating to me, because they're doing it in a way where it's saying, this is special. Sex is something that is really special. It's really important. It's something set aside. It is something for you as a couple to do over here that makes your life better. This is something that is unique and special and something that you should privilege. But it's also something you should be doing every day. I mean, they don't say that, but you should be doing it regularly. It's something that is a part of your life. It is something that is an inherent part of your life. And it is something that is also very bodily, which is also not very often associated with the sacred. At least, again, in UK, US cultures.
Yes, because particularly in paradigms of sacred and profane, the body is not the true self.
No.
The body is the vessel in which the soul operates. And I'm describing it in very Scientological terms, so you can see which movements I research. But that's the everyday side of oneself, whereas the sacred essentially nourishes the soul.
Yes. And that's what I'm wanting to stress, that it's a very Christian way of understanding what is sacred and what is profane,
and it's a very
what
Christian
is special.
attitude towards sex as well.
Well, and again, Christianity has greatly affected the US and the UK culture. And it is something we have said before, and we will continue saying for a very long time, that even if you are an atheist, or if you are Hindu, or if you are whatever, if you are growing up in the UK or in the US, you are being affected by a Christian culture. And I think most people who are not Christian and not atheist, growing up in these cultures, deeply understand that, because they are often, like my sex-repulsed asexuals who are constantly complaining about the barrage of sexuality being forced down their throat. There are many people who are not Christian being shoved Christianity down their throats, and they just put up with it. But it is something that is, for those of you who are unaware of it, is deeply there. And there are other cultures and societies and countries as well that are also affected by Christianity, and there are other ones that are affected by different religions. But again, our position, we can only speak with authority on a few things. And so that's what we will focus on. But I'd love to hear from those of you living in other countries, A, whether or not this show is being featured on your Netflix. That would be utterly fascinating. And B, if you are living in a different society and culture, how different the attitudes of sex are. I would really love to hear that. For people who are interested, we do have a friend of ours who has written a book on sex, particularly on the BDSM community. I believe the book's out. I think it came out a little bit ago now.
Yes.
So you should go check that out. Alison Robertson wrote a book about the BDSM community and religion, and it is very good research. It's just very good. So go and read that. I was going to try to pull up a lot of her quotes and stuff when I was doing this, and then I just decided I can't. Like, I will just pinpoint and flag out that book. I'll link a link to it in the description of this episode as well, for those of you who are interested. But so there are people doing research on sex and religion. It's not just that Alid and I thought of something quite weird. There are a lot of people doing it, and it is incredibly fascinating research.
Yes, the book is called Play, Pain and Religion.
Yes. So go check that out. It's very good. If you're interested at all in the intersections of religion and sex, and particularly, again, her research was on the BDSM community, so conversations about kink. Is also a pivotal point in her conversation. And I think her whole thesis is on how BDSM, like how we talk about how popular culture is religion, it's BDSM is religion.
Indeed. Everything is religion.
Because everything is religion.
I saw that. Did you see that fantastic meme on Twitter the other day that it was about how religious studies will just approach any conversation and just say everything is religion?
I did, and I felt personally attacked.
Yes, we definitely see ourselves in that, don't we? But I'm now after we finish recording this episode, I'm going to be fighting the urge to go on Twitter and tweet Durkheim failed to consider stripper poles in the bedroom. Yeah.
I mean, you should. Maybe that'll be my little sound bite when I am promoting this show.
Yeah. Durkheim failed to consider... But Durkheim has been undone by the stripper pole. Who saw that coming, eh?
You know.
Definitely
I'm sure
not Durkheim.
It has been written of before. Strippers are the true heroes of our society.
Indeed.
If people want to get you more uncomfortable by talking to you about sex in their cultures or societies, or what they think about it, or what shows you should be watching on Netflix, where can they go, Alid?
They can go to my Twitter page at AlidJLL and hit up a conversation with me there.
I would like to mention, I'm going to cede a little bit of my plug time to this, for the pod as a more general thing. I've gotten a couple of people voicing the fact that they really enjoy the pod and stuff like that. I do not do this very often, but doing things like reviews is really fantastic. I'm not one of those podcasters that at the end of everything or at the beginning of everything is like, hey, review us 5 stars or whatever. But it really does help. I know that
Hit that subscribe button.
Yeah, smash that subscribe button.
Ring the bell.
But if you are somebody who feels like you really enjoy this podcast and you want other people to know about it, the best way you can do about that is A, telling people, and B, sharing a review or putting down a review, because the more reviews that something has, the more it'll show up on just other people's feeds, which means that you're essentially telling other people about it without actually having to be our missionary to go out and share that. So I don't ask for this very often, but doing reviews is really fantastic, and you can do that anywhere. Wherever you are listening to your podcast is fantastic.
That would be great.
And obviously be in touch with the show. We've gotten a couple of emails from a couple of listeners. I'm trying to figure out whether I want to have like a bonus episode where we answer some stuff, or whether we'll just send some emails out separately. But either way, I'm going to be responding to the emails that we are getting. It's just a matter of how we decide to do that. So I am really enjoying reading them. I know that Alid really enjoys hearing from people as well. So,
yes.
Shoot us your thoughts. And, we've had some people coming in and, arguing against some of our points, which we also enjoy. That's what discourse and academic discourse is all about, is hearing different opinions.
It's all a conversation.
It is. So if you disagree with some of the things that we've said, then let us know. And, maybe we can even have like a little response thing where we chat about some of the things that we've had.
Yeah, absolutely.
So definitely send us an email at religionpopculturepod@gmail.com, and you can follow the pod on Twitter at @RPC_pod. And of course you can follow me on Twitter at Vivian Asimos. I'll throw that in real quick. But thank you for enjoying the pod, or not. Maybe you didn't enjoy it. Let us know if you didn't enjoy it. That sounds so terrible. I'll edit that out, maybe. We'll see. If you're listening to this, I did not edit it out. But thank you for joining us for this episode of the Religion Popular Culture Podcast. And Alid, thank you for indulging in my discussion of sex rooms when I just sent you a message being like, I want to talk about this show on Netflix called Sex Rooms. And you went, okay.
Okay, that sounds good to me. Yes.
So thank you for that.
No problem.
And until next time.
Until next time. Bye, folks.
Bye.